afternoon. I'm Melissa Barnett. I'm the director of the Francis McClelland Institute for Children, Youth, and Families. And we really work to support innovative research, to collaborate with community partners, and to share research to get it into the hands of service providers and families, all with the goal of creating opportunities for all children, youth, and families, especially those from marginalized communities, to have the opportunity to reach their full potential. Everything we do is in honor of the legacy of Francis McClelland. Frances herself lived a life that exemplified resilience, and she was also a staunch advocate for children, youth, and families. We're also grateful to the support of another staunch advocate, Pamela J. Turbeville. This is the first in our series of the Pamela J. Turbeville Speaker Series. And we are grateful to the ongoing support in multiple ways of Pam Turbeville to the Norton School and specifically to the Francis McClelland Institute and to the Speaker Series. I want to just take a moment to let you know about some upcoming events. On Thursday, October 22nd, we're really excited to have our annual Vision Awards ceremony, and due to the current health restrictions, we are going to be holding this virtually. It will be recorded and we will be streaming it live here on our Facebook site. If you're joining us now for the talk today on Facebook, come back on the 22nd at 4:30, where we can recognize some really outstanding individuals who are contributing to their communities. And then the next talk in our Turbeville Speaker Series will be Thursday, November 5th at 3:30, and we'll be welcoming Dr. Ada Wilkinson-Lee, who will be talking about using community-based participatory research to address health disparities in Latinx communities. Today, or for updates, please follow us on social media, sign up for our listserv, visit our website. If you haven't been to our website for a while or you've never been there, we've done a lot to update it. Please come visit it. We're trying to make it a resource really for everyone in the community, as well as for researchers. So we all know that the coronavirus pandemic is exacerbating long-standing social, health, and economic inequities. At the same time, it's providing some opportunities for us to really understand what might it take to build communities that truly do support children, youth, and families, what policies may already be in place, what policies may need to be in place, what research do we need, what tools do we need to help ensure that families can be resilient and communities. And so in that spirit, we're so pleased today to kick off our speaker series for the fall with Dr. Danielle Hiraldo. Dr. Hiraldo received her PhD in the American Indian Studies program at the University of Arizona. She is a researcher, outreach specialist, and senior researcher at the Native Nations Institute for Leadership, Management, and Policy here at the University of Arizona. She, as you can see, she holds a master's degree and a BA in political science with a concentration in pre-law from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. And Dr. Hiraldo is a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. And so we're so pleased to have her here today to present her work on such an important and timely topic. And so at this point, I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn the screen over to Dr. Hiraldo. I also want to mention that if we welcome your questions, if you could please hold those to the end. You can either enter them in the Q&A chat bar, or you can raise your hand in the participant bar and we will go ahead and unmute you and call on you. So please, we hope you have questions. We're hoping to have a lively discussion. If you just remember those and hold on to them to the end, that would be terrific. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and let Dr. Hiraldo share. Thank you.
And I'm talking with the mute button on. So thank you for that warm introduction. Can you see my screen okay? Awesome. Well, I'm excited to present a new project that some colleagues and I at the Native Nations Institute have started to engage. And it's really around looking at the tribal codes, tribal public health, and emergency preparedness codes that exist out in Indian country in the US. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say, and any comments or feedbacks that we can might strengthen this project is really important. Before I get started, I want to recognize the traditional homelands that the University of Arizona is situated. The Tanata people and then the Pasquayaki tribe has called this area home for many, many years. I won't go too much into my background because it was already given. Thank you for that. But I am a citizen of the Lumbee tribe on my mom's side, and my dad, I'm Puerto Rican, and I am a product of the University of Arizona out of the American Indian Studies Department. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Native Nations Institute, which is situated at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy. You can see the vision and the mission here on the slide, but I wanted to let you know that the Udall Center, or the Native Nations Institute, specifically serves as a public service unit. So we do not have, we're not a degree granting institution, but we do serve as a resource for Indigenous organizations and Native nations who are interested in supporting Indigenous self-determination and strengthening Indigenous governance capacities through economic and community development objectives. And we do this in a couple of ways: through research, education, tribal services, and digital resources. So our research is really founded on what's known as the Native Nation building approach. And this comes out of work that started with Stephen Cornell and Joseph Kalt, and later Dr. Manley Begay, when they were at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, which is our sister organization. And they looked at why some tribes were more economically successful than others. And they really saw that as they started engaging in the census data and talking to tribal leaders, that it wasn't necessarily an economic problem, but a governance challenge. And that's when they came up with this nation building approach, and I'll go through those in a bit. And we've continued that. Stephen Cornell came to the Udall Center, was a director for many years, and we've continued that research, and we've been able to grow it in a number of areas, such as social determinants of health, child welfare, access to capital credit, Indigenous data sovereignty, and more recently, Indigenous research governance, governance under state recognition, and some others. Given that we are a public service entity, we've been able to partner with the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program over at the law school at the University of Arizona to develop an Indigenous programs, Indigenous governance programs, and that's in our education and professional development service area. There, if you're interested in obtaining a master's degree, so you can take classes for credit, or if there are tribal officials or others who are interested in learning more about Indigenous governance, you can take classes not for credit, and just gain that better understanding of how tribes are engaging in nation building and governing effectively. We also have digital resources. We have the Indigenous Governance Database, which is a free resource out there for folks who are interested in some of these subject areas. We have some of the things that we've published in-house, some of our colleagues in the United States and internationally are also featured on there. And we've also have a whole host of videos that we have recorded in-house of tribal leaders talking about some of these governance and government challenges. Our work in the research area and our work on the ground in the community led to the development of our Constitutions Resource Center. And that's essentially another outlet of the Indigenous Governance Database that provides information to Indigenous students, communities, leaders who are interested in knowing more about constitutions, what constitutional reform looks like in Indian country, and how they might be able to best rewrite or rethink the way that they govern in many ways. A lot of our work within tribal services is on the ground in the communities, working with either elected leaders, tribal key professionals within the tribal government, or the Indigenous organizations, where we are going in and providing that nation building training and education. And we develop different customized services depending on the needs of the community. And we provide that facilitation, whether it's through constitutional reform talks, whether it's ways of identifying priorities within their communities. Those are some of the things that we do within the Tribal Service Arm. And as I mentioned before, all of our work at the Native Nations Institute is founded on these research principles called the nation building approach. And early on, Joseph Kalt, Stephen Cornell, and Dr. Manley Begay, they went out and as they were examining these communities, they saw that the ones that were engaging these nation building principles were doing these 5 things. So they were asserting practical self-rule. The nation was in the driver's seat. They were making the decisions, not an outside government. They were backing up that assertion with capable governing institutions. So they're passing the laws, developing an independent judiciary or dispute resolution mechanism. And then they were doing that founded in culture. Oftentimes we talk about this, not that we will be able to be who we are or who we were 50 or 100 years ago, but being able to identify those cultural traditions and practices that we did long before the creation of the United States and the creation of other countries, and be able to implement those into a contemporary setting within our government and our governance systems. And often we talk about within tribal communities, we talk about this 7 generations thinking. So the decisions that we make today impact 7 generations from now. And we, Dr. Cornell and Dr. Cole and Dr. Begay saw that the nations that were engaging in these nation building principles were thinking about those 7 generations from that day that they were making that decision, not just necessarily being reelected or not just necessarily addressing the need of today, but how you can address that need and still be able to maintain or to address needs that might come up in the future. And they're really doing it as these leaders, and not necessarily elected leaders, but people who were in the community who saw the need for change and were actually bringing the community along to make that change happen. So like I said before, this is really the foundation of all of the work that we do at the Native Nations Institute. And I like to do a little bit of interaction, and I don't know how well this is going to work, but Allie, do we have access to the chat function, or can folks chime into the chat function? I wanted to just kind of survey you all to see if you have an understanding or see where you're at with what Indigenous knowledge, if you will, at least within the United States. We have the raise hand function. Okay, awesome. So anybody have an idea of how many federally recognized tribes exist in the US? And you can use a chat or raise your hand. I'll call you out. Okay, Andrew says 574. Cheryl says over 500. Linda, over 500. Yeah, thank you. So we have about 574 federally recognized tribes that share geography with the United States, and about 63 state recognized tribes. So when we talk about the different recognition status, we know that federal recognized tribes develop a government to government relationship with the US Congress, whereas state recognized tribes develop that government to government relationship with the state in which they share geography. And then we also have several non-recognized tribes, and that's essentially an external government has not recognized the inherent authority of that nation. And within the United States, we have about 5.4 or a little less than 2% of the US population self-identifies as American Indian. About 78% resides off reservation, so outside of the boundaries of the nation, and about 55.7 million acres are trust land held in trust for nations. How about with Arizona? How many tribes or Native nations share geography with Arizona? Andrew, 22, yes. Andrew, I think I don't know if I could allow you to answer, but I guess we will. So there's about 22 federally recognized tribes that share geography with the state of Arizona. Roughly to a little over 250,000 reside on res. About 5.3% of the Arizona's population controls. And then tribes control 19.7 million acres. So you can see on my screen, this large reservation for Navajo. It obviously extends over into Utah and then into New Mexico. Same with the Thanatham. Often you would hear citizens of the Thanatham Nation mention that the international boundary crossed them, that they didn't cross the international boundary. They very much have relations here in what is current day the country of Mexico. But I also, as we're talking about Indigenous peoples, I also want you to know that there's a couple of concepts and terms that we use very often. So we often refer to just generally American Indian or Native American, Indigenous most of the times in the global context, and then Native. There's also Alaska Native, Hawaiian Native. There's a common abbreviation for American Indian, Alaska Native. We see that a lot within the census records. As collectives, we'll talk about tribes, Native nations, Indian community, or indigenous communities. And then there's also Indian country, which is a legal term that is supported by case law. And this is really all to get at the fact that Native nations, indigenous peoples maintain an inherent right of authority. And I'd like to go back. Often when we talk about indigenous peoples, we're talking about generally American Indian, Indigenous, Native American. But as a Lumbee, I would refer to myself as Lumbee rather than the general term American Indian or Native American. I would refer to myself as Lumbee first. But that, as I mentioned before, that goes to that distinct nature of our political standing, that we are not simply another ethnic enclave within the United States, but that there's legal political standing and that is inherent authority that it comes with our traditional governing systems, our ability to make those decisions long before settlers and then the formation of the United States. I have a quick video that I wanted to show and I wanted to share with you all that talks about sovereignty. It was produced by the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. And then I'll get into some of the specifics of our project that we're working on.
Sovereignty refers to the inherent right or power to govern a people or territory. For example, most people are citizens of a nation, and they follow the laws and government of that nation. They are part of a sovereign nation. Before this continent was colonized, there were lots of people who belonged to lots of separate sovereign nations, each with their own set of laws and government. But then non-native people arrived who wanted the land for themselves. So they made treaties with the native people. Treaties are agreements between two nations. So by signing treaties with the native peoples, the United States government recognized the sovereign status of tribes, treating them as foreign nations and left them to regulate their own affairs. They also created reservations for most Indian people. Reservations are designed by treaty, executive order, or action of Congress. The United States government declared that the federal tribal relationship would be one of domestic dependent nations, to whom the federal government had a fiduciary relationship. U.S. presidents used to call themselves the Great Father to Indian people. So they made legislation that treated the U.S. government as the guardian of Indian peoples. Most Indian land is held in trust by the United States, and the United States has overriding power over Indian affairs. But because tribes were recognized as sovereign nations in those treaties, they still reserve the rights they have never given away, like the right to govern themselves. Unless a treaty or federal statute removes the power, the tribes are assumed to possess it. And state laws generally do not apply to tribal members in Indian country. So here on our reservation, most native people are members of the sovereign Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes or nations and are self-governed, but they are also U.S. citizens. It is a complicated nation within a nation system that keeps Indian law attorneys and administrators on their toes, but preserves a fundamental right and freedom for native peoples throughout the United States.
So there's a couple of things that I want to point out with that video: the use of trust responsibilities that are connected to those treaties and to those agreements that the United States made with indigenous peoples and Native nations. Those are often represented in education or health services that are connected or that are provided to indigenous peoples. It's not a special privilege, it's a part of those treaty negotiations that occurred. So Native nations ceded land in response, the United States gave those either protection, education, and tribal services, health services in return for that cession of land. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of those treaty making actions that occurred or activities that occurred, because there's a lot of things that we have to unpack when we talk about treaty negotiations. And also know that in 1871, the United States unilaterally said, we're no longer going to negotiate treaties with tribal nations, but we still need land, so we're still going to negotiate either through executive order or through any type of land agreement for that land cessions. So here in the state of Arizona, I think Navajo is the only tribe that's a treaty tribe. For instance, Thanatham is an executive order reservation. But what really matters to Native nations is some of the bullet points. I'm sure folks on the line and others might say that there are more. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's really about maintaining, enhancing our religion, culture, and language, maintaining and protecting those political autonomy and sovereign rights, and of course, the welfare of our people and lands. And I'm just going to do a quick and dirty recap of federal Indian policy, because that impacts the ways in which Native nations govern today in the United States, at least. So really early on, there was this international relationship. As I mentioned before, there was treaty negotiations that occurred. There were two sovereigns negotiating or relating with one another on two sovereigns levels. Late in the 18th and early 20th century, we see the United States adopting various assimilation and oppressive practices and policies to ensure that Native indigenous peoples adopt Americanized ways of knowing. And it's really to take away that distinct nature of who we are as a people. And then in the 1930s, we see the United States starting to recognize some of that self-governing authority with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, where tribes had the ability to adopt a written constitution that was oftentimes provided by the federal government, and that lacked some of those checks and balances or allocation of authorities that we traditionally see within our communities, and impose some of these like electoral ways of identifying our leaders. And then through the civil rights in 1960s and 1970s, we see this movement of Indian self-determination, indigenous governance, self-governance, and all of these other federal policies that start to move federal programs that were run by federal agencies into the hands of Native nations. And they're able to do that through contracting and compacting, specifically within the Indian Health Services realm. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on just these two pieces of legislation. I've already talked about the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, but there's also, when we're talking about emergency management, the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. That is something not specific to Indigenous communities, but it authorizes the U.S. President to declare an emergency or major disasters in situations where the responses are beyond the capacity of a state or local government. And often we see under the Robert Stafford Act, where Native nations, if they had to declare an emergency or had to appeal to the president to declare an emergency, they would have to do that by way of the state. Well, in 2013, the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act went around, there was a loophole where the nation was able to go directly to the president to declare that emergency rather than having to go through the red tape of the state and the other bureaucracies that are often found. And so these are the kind of the basis that we start to look at some of these health codes, tribal public health codes and emergency management codes within the current state of the pandemic. So early on, we see scholars come out and they, at first we get a lot of propaganda that says that we're all in this together, but we know that that's not true. We see scholars come out and say that Indigenous peoples suffer higher infection rates, more severe symptoms, and death greater than the general white population because of these social determinants of health and lack of political authority to on a national or a global scale to be able to enact some of these authorities that are important. We see that these stressors are older age, multi-generational housing, lack of running water. We see that some of these stressors within our communities attribute to these impact that COVID-19 has on our communities. And then we also see our economic health being impacted. We've seen really early on, before the pandemic occurred, there was about $12.5 billion that were put into tribal government programs and services prior to the pandemic. And then that once the shutdown occurred and the nations had to close many of their enterprises, gaming and non, that their states and regions were actually impacted really early, severely, and we don't know the outcome of that yet. But we also saw a couple of anecdotal stories that were coming out of Indian country. We saw the Lummi Nation implementing a rapid response, and they used their existing emergency health powers that they adopted. And this allowed them to prepare a response as early as February, and then the elected leaders and health officials began gathering medical supplies, including test kits, and arranging for test processing. We see the Navajo Nation declaring an emergency early on, creating curfews, as well as prohibiting mass gatherings and advising citizens to stay home. We see now, 6 months later, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who we all know as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, has publicly stated that the Navajo efforts could serve as a response model to other countries. And then we also see the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota set up checkpoints where they are blocking off any travel into the nation's jurisdiction unless you're essential services, essential services and essential responses. So we started looking at these examples and thought, well, if Lummi Nation, if Navajo Nation, if they are asserting these sovereign authorities through these public health codes or through these other mechanisms that are in place, who else is doing that and what exists out there? So what we ended up doing is we developed a data set, and this is very, very, very early on in the study. So this is just kind of survey of the land of what's available. And we searched the Tribal Gateway on the National Indian Law Library and Tribal Court Clearinghouse databases to see where there might be some tribally specific public health and emergency codes and see where that capacity exists during the current COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw titles, these codes range from communicable diseases, we saw emergency management and homeland security, environmental health, public health emergency, public health and human services, public health and safety. And what we ended up doing is we took these 41 codes that we were able to gather from 37 different Native nations and code them, finding the themes that kind of came out of our survey of these codes. And then also from some of the previous work that has been done by HOS, by the CDC, NCAI, which is the National Congress of American Indians, and then other scholars So we identified these 11 themes, which is environment, crimes against health. So a lot of times in Indian country, we see tribes pass law and order codes, and they might have a provision in that law and order code that's specific to public health. We didn't use that in this data set. We looked at standalone public health codes or emergency codes. And in those emergency health codes or public health codes, they might have this provision for a criminal sanction against some type of health violation. We looked at whether or not there was quarantine and isolation provisions, incident command systems. We wanted to see if the tribe or the nation was affirming its sovereignty and governance, whether or not they've been able to incorporate any culture, specific culture provisions within the code that is unique to them, as well as the data sharing, because we know during this time that data sharing is definitely something that tribes need access to and would like to regulate as well. So we did just a quick, thanks to Kyra, she did a quick coding, provided a table of us, and we see that over half of the codes that we found do identify communicable diseases in their code. We see a good number have this point of contact for tribal public health issues, emergency, of course, environment, and then the crimes against health as well. So for instance, the Stockbridge-Munsee adopted a communicable disease vaccination quarantine ordinance, and it states that the nation needs to prepare for possible bioterrorism issues and other communicable diseases. If this area is left unaddressed, the political integrity, economic security, and the general health and welfare is threatened. We see in Jamestown, Sklama tribe, the public health and safety code states that the tribal health care providers will assist local health officials in identifying exposed contacts. We see in the Pasquayaki tribe, a local tribe here in Tucson, passing a public health code, as well as developing emergency preparedness plan. The Chitimacha tribe of Louisiana actually includes a tracking system or a tracking provision within their code that mentions that the public health authority shall assert the existence of an illness or health condition that may be potential cause of public health emergency, investigate, and then define the distribution of the health or of the illness or the condition. And we all know now that the importance of having those tracking and tracing mechanisms to better contain the virus is definitely something that is recommended by public health officials. We also see emergency management ordinances that include incident command management system, incident command systems. They've been able to identify the person who has the authority to declare the emergency, whether or not one exists. We see only a handful, which we were a bit surprised about. I've gone through some of these. Only a handful that have actually recognized some cultural connection. The Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation is a really good example of this, where they've incorporated a tribal health philosophy and its environmental health and safety code. And you can read that here on the screen where it says, spiritually, we do not separate ourselves from the surrounding natural world. Therefore, the land, air, water, and natural resources of the Umatilla Reservation must be maintained to sustain all forms of life using both traditional ways and modern technology. We recognize that responsibility to intervene in human activities that create an unhealthy imbalance in nature is essential to protecting all natural resources. And that they're making the declaration that the environment health is definitely connected to the community health as well. We coded for time, so this time is specific to whether or not the last activity. So whether or not the tribe enacted it, whether or not the code said it was enacted in a certain date or last amended, so that we coded for the last activity. And most of the times it was the last amended. What was interesting, we see a handful, we see a spike during the 2009 and 2010 year, and we know that that's correlated to the H1N1. We don't know if that's specifically, that's the reason why the nations were passing those laws, but we do know that that was going on in that time period. And then we see this gradual peak of nations passing these tribal public health codes and emergency preparedness codes from 2010 to 2020, especially a spike in 2020, with the exception of no activity in 2014. Here's just an idea. You can kind of get a lay of the land. We see the most activity happening in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Washington. We see a handful of activity happening in the Southeast, and then one in the Northeast. And this is obviously not earth-shattering or any type of huge revelations that we've been able to find with this particular project, but we think that there is something there for Native nations to consider when we're thinking about what tribal public health codes look like and how they might best assert their sovereignty in a way that makes sense to them. So generally, we find that many of the codes adopted use mainstream health and safety language and emergency language that's often found in local and state codes. But we think there's a great opportunity for Native nations to position these codes to align with their own culture. Specifically, if you think about the Umatilla example of articulating a tribal health philosophy, and how those values might best help address community challenges during times of pandemics or of other emergencies such as this. And we definitely see that more policy research is needed. There's been 3 studies that looked at tribal health codes before this, but we think that there's areas that we might be able to develop perhaps cases that really looked at, how some of these nations, especially like Lummi, Navajo, and others, were able to act so fast and effective areas compared to state or other even national governments. So there's obviously the existence of these institutions is not directly tied to the outcomes found in some of the current pandemic. And this obviously does not account to all of the lives that have been lost and all of the families that are still dealing with this pandemic. But there is an argument to be made that having codes in place makes responding to public health and emergency crisis now and in the future less reactionary and more proactive in meeting community needs. In addition, these institutions advance the public health outcomes that we all want to see in our communities. So that's all I have. Thank you for having me, and I'd like to open it up to questions and concerns or anything else you may have.
Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question and can unmute you, or you can put your question in the chat or the Q&A if you prefer.
Okay, Cheryl?
Yeah, hi Danielle, thanks for the presentation. Did you compare these codes, because you have them by tribe and by state, to to like any actual COVID-19 infection rate numbers by state or by tribe?
No, but that could be something that we can do in the future, yes.
Yeah, I bet you'd be able to get at some of your hunches there that you presented at the end. Cool.
Thank you. Were there any searches done? So Francine asked if there's any searches done for IHS policy adoptions. No, these were just specific to the public health and tribal codes. Francine, do you think that there's something that we should consider within the IHS policies?
Great, thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you for all that you've done and the great queries that you ran. So I was just thinking that for facilities that have, that are either 638 or self-determination tribes, that if there were still more direct services, that they wouldn't have as much liberty or maybe as much motivation to have been developing codes if they felt that there was something already in place. And so I think that would be an important element to consider as you're moving forward with these analyses.
Yeah. Thank you, Francine.
I'll ask a question if no one else
Thanks.
has one. Can you talk a little bit more about the data sharing provisions that you found that in five codes related to data sharing? If that was really data sharing within tribes, or and speak to the sort of the complications of data sharing both within and outside.
Yeah, there weren't specific to data sharing, so we had to be really subjective when we were looking at some of these. So a lot of it was connecting with the local health officials to identify or to share whether or not individuals were infected, or any type of like health type of related data that would exist. There was one tribe, and I can't remember exactly the nation. They developed an actual data sharing agreement that comes out of their tribal health public health code, but I can't remember the nation or the agreement specifically. Thank you. Cheryl.
Sorry. Did you find that some Native nations who had implemented or written some sort of health code at one point in time, like say it was earlier, and then they followed up with another one, like that they started making more of them? Or did, in most of the cases, it was like a one sort of incidence for each Native nation?
There were several that we found, and of course I have to say that these were only publicly available, so there are probably more than likely a number of tribal health codes that we just don't have access to because nations aren't required to share it with non-citizens. But we were able to, and I completely spaced on what you asked, Cheryl. What did you ask again?
Oh, so I was just curious, like you gave us like that table of like the groupings that you had coded each sort of like to align with like data sharing or whatever. And I was wondering if you saw, I guess I sort of imagine where a Native nation would create some sort of code at some point in time, and creating that code, then later at another point in time, they would want to create another one, and there would be documentation of sort of like that building up or the addition to.
Yeah, so we saw a lot of, I think there were a couple of nations that only had the original code available. So we don't know for sure if any amendments were made to it, but there are a couple that was documented the amendments that occurred and then that legislative history too, which is really informative and helpful too. But most of the time it just stated whether or not the last activity, so whether or not it was amended or the original date. Thank you, Linda.
Any other questions, comments?
Well, I appreciate this feedback. Like I said, it's still early and we're just trying to figure out what exists and how this might be useful to Native Nations as they're thinking about building those institutions or strengthening them in some ways.
Actually, I have one more question, sort of. So did you find that some of the nations had multiple policies? So you sort of had the count for how many of those kinds of policies. Was it that they tended to sort of focus on one area, or there were some tribes that had really comprehensive policies across all of those areas?
Yeah, there was only less than a handful that actually had those comprehensive policies. So there are four specifically that adopted both an emergency preparedness or emergency management code in addition to its public health code. But there are only a handful that were doing that. So Catherine asked, are there any plans to follow up by talking to tribal leaders about how they wrote the public health codes? It would be useful for tribes writing public health codes to know about the process of writing and enacting them. Yeah, I think that eventually that's exactly the route that we would like to go, Catherine, is to develop these cases and identifying maybe some best practices